Yeah, 6 reasons, if you're studying butterflies already, 6 reasons for looking at moths as well. There are over 1,600 moth species in Cumbria, perhaps only around 45 butterflies. Moths have a longer flight season than butterflies. Some species are active even in winter. Now there's an excellent range of field guides, ID websites and moth traps, more than ever before. Even the garden trap could attract 500 or more species over time. And that's really useful if you're not too mobile and you want to stay around home. You can do so much if you have a garden. Moths are found in a much wider range of habitats than butterflies, and with a greater diversity of feeding habits. And finally, for the photographer and recorder, they're much less flighty. Moths from a trap will stay still, and they're easier to inspect, easier to identify and to photograph. So that's 6 reasons why you should think about studying moths, not instead of butterflies, but in addition to. About 10 years ago, the whole of Lepidoptera were reclassified, what they call a taxonomic reclassification. Through DNA analysis and modern techniques, they're able to move some moths from one family to another. And they created 74 new families covering moths and butterflies. And each family has a number on the left, starting with 01. Numbers 1 and 2 are very small micro moths. Number 3, which we shall come to, is honorary macro moths, which are quite big macro moths, but they're numbered among the micros because they're very, very primitive. They don't have mouth parts, they don't feed. So there's an evolutionary thread running through this. The most primitive moths are in the early classes, and the most developed or advanced are towards the end. And you'll notice that butterflies come somewhere just after the middle of this. And this ordering, this suggests that butterflies are just part of the continuing evolutionary process of Lepidoptera, placed mainly between micro and macro moth families. So now we've got that out of the way, that butterflies and moths are all the same. What about macro moths and micro moths? That's another quite artificial distinction. We can see top left that macro, generally larger moths, about 600 species have been recorded in Cumbria. And the wing length varies from about 7 to 40 millimeters. We measure wing length, the length of the leading edge, rather than wingspan, because different moths have different resting positions, as you can see with the 2 on this screen. Some rest with the wings wide open, others closed. So wing length is a good measure. So the smallest macro moths are only 7 millimeters, but of the nearly 1,000 micro moth species, some are down to 3 millimeters long, but some are 17 millimeters. So there's a massive overlap between the 2. On the right, I've done a small insect of a typical small micro moth to scale with the elephant hawk moth. The elephant hawk moth has a wing length about 30 millimeters, the micro moth of about 5. So it's 5 or 6 times the wing length of the smaller one. I'll just say about photographs. Most of the ones are mine. They're not works of art. Most of them are simply taken as either records or evidence shots. Where someone else has photographed, I've credited them or tried to do. If they're taken in Cardiff or Cornwall, they've been supplied by my son George, who was active in those 2 places. So but the vast majority of the slides were taken either in Cumbria or a lot of them in our garden in central Kendal, where I live. So this is the trick question. These 2 are to scale. Which is the macro, which is the micro? And you can probably guess that on the little one is the macro. The macro, least minor, is only about 7 millimeters long. The very common micro, small magpie, is a wing length about twice as much. So there's this huge overlap. A typical pair here, which one from a macro moth family called Oaknictioline from a family called Nollidae, and a micro from the Tortrix family. You can see from the measurements at the bottom that they're quite similar, and one could be forgiven for picking up the wrong field guide to look at these. This is just a list of some of the main families of moths. I won't go through them, but you can see number 70, Geometridae, carpets, pugs, and many others, are a large family with over 300 species. Number 73, Noctuidae, mainly generally stout-bodied species, and the second largest family. And the biggest of all, number 49 at the bottom, Tortricidae or Tortrix moths, are the largest family of all with over 380 species. So we start on our quick tour through the different families of moths. The swifts are often called honorary macros. They're low down among the micros in the classification. They can't feed, the caterpillars can, but the adults here can't feed. They've no mouth parts, so they don't take any nectar. The one on the right, map-winged swift, comes in two distinct forms. The top form is the more common, but the bottom one, Gallicus, is perhaps a third, quarter of all records. They are the same species and can interbreed, so it's believed. So there are about 5 species of swift moths in Cumbria. On the left, Eponomutidae. Many of you will have seen these Hermine moths. They often seen as caterpillar webs or nets. The caterpillars are gregarious, live in huge colonies, and they leave swathes of greyish webbing in hedgerow plants, and the larvae can cause defoliation of plants. There are about 6 of these in Cumbria, 6 of the Hermine moths. The one on the top left with many rows of dots is called Eponomuta ivonimella, or bird cherry ermine. Maybe that's the commonest one, and that's the only one that can be confidently identified as an adult by counting the rows of dots. So the other ones, really, records generally not accepted of adult ermine moths of the other species. On the right, there's a group called Ipsilopha or Ipsilophidae. There's about 16 species of those, not all in Cumbria. The one at the top, Ipsilopha sequella, we laughingly call this the Easter bunny moth. Viewed from above, as in the little picture top right, you've got the rabbit's head and ears. Another one below, Ipsilopha dentella. Another species, Galecidae, another family, I would say. There are around 160 species in Britain. They are quite varied in size and shape. A gentleman in Lancashire, Steve Palmer, and his wife Caroline run the National Galecid Recording Scheme. And it was Steve who took this specimen from me and set it, identified it first, and set it as it would be set for a museum specimen, and then photographed it. So if that were in a museum, that's how it would appear. Whereas in the flesh, it would be more like the one bottom right, with the hind wings not visible. On many species, the hind wing are quite an important feature of identification. On the top, Briar Domestica, like its name, is often found in the house, and there it's camouflaged. I'm not sure on what. Yeah, but a Lucitidae, there's just one British species in this family. Very, very common, but far too nice. This is one which many of you will have seen, sometimes indoors, the 20-plumed moth, or many-plumed moth, a Lucita Hexadactyler. The larvae feed on honeysuckle, and they're found in every month of the year among vegetation, quite often in light traps and sometimes even indoors. It's a wing length of about 8 millimeters, so it's about in the middle size of the micro moth range. That was in the garden trap. And then we come to plume moths. There are about 45 species in the UK. The rest with the wings tightly rolled up together. Some of these are quite tricky to identify. Not all of them can be done without dissection of the genitalia, which is not something we'd normally be doing as a beginner. These 4 were all found in Cumbria. 3 of them were in our garden trap. 1 was found in a light trap at Smardale. The commonest one perhaps is bottom left, Hermine Moths, which rolls its wings tighter than any of the others. Top left, sometimes known as the white plume, Pterophorus Pentadactyl, is found day flying as well as coming to moth traps occasionally. So they're quite an interesting group, but the identification of some of them does require dissection techniques. And then we come to the biggest family of all, the Tortricidae or Tortrix moths. These are a very diverse family with a big size range, and the rest, some of them in different positions. Some of them feed inside flower heads or inside vegetation stems. Others feed on spinnings of the leaves of the food plants. You can see here I've shown simply a scientific name for all 5 of these. 2 of them do have a common vernacular name. On the right, Epiblema udmaniana is known as the bramble-shoot moth. Epiphyus pusvitana is known as the light brown apple moth, which came as an import from Australia, I don't know how long, 50 years ago perhaps. But there has been an attempt recently to give all of the micros a vernacular name. Some of them sound quite silly and they're generally not used. Top one, Aclaris calliana, is called maple button. Agapeta zoigana, bottom left, is called knapweed conch. And the one in the middle is called marbled bell. These names would mean nothing to a visitor from another country. So certainly if you were dealing in moths internationally, you wouldn't be using these new vernaculars. But there are about maybe 20% of all micro moths do have a long-standing traditional vernacular name. Yeah, these are just some more from the Tortrix family, all from Cumbria. Bottom left, Aclaris literana was photographed in the garden at Plum Garths. One at Roudsey Woods, another at Meathop. So they're all from round and about. All very attractive, very different in shape, possibly fairly similar sizes, different in shape, certainly different in markings and coloration. Coming on now to the clear wings and hornets. There are about 16 members in this family, but only about 5 of them in Cumbria. They have transparent wings and mimic flies or mimic hornets. The one on the left, current clear wing, hadn't been recorded in Cumbria for about 30 years, but we found we had lots of them in our allotment. I bought some lures, pheromone lures, and hung them among the blackcurrant bushes. And in the first night, there were over 40. Sorry, it was not night, it was during daytime. And there were over 40 of these moths in the pheromone trap. So they're probably quite common. But first of all, people don't go looking for things like this in daytime. And second, they don't look a bit like moth. Another clear wing, top right, was only found in Cumbria about 4 or 5 years ago, the Welsh clear wing. The larvae of that feed on old gnarled birch trees. The female deposits the egg into a small hole in the bark of the tree, and the caterpillar lives for a couple of years under the bark and then finally emerges through a hole. Sometimes it leaves an exuvia in the way that a dragonfly would. So we're going to spend more time looking for this Welsh clearwing. We feel sure it should be fairly common around Cumbria. Finally, at the bottom, the Lunar Hornet, which my son found in Cardiff, is a mimic of a wasp, but there are a handful of recent records from North Cumbria. And then many of you will be familiar with these, the Zygonidae, foresters and burnets. There's about 10 species in total in Britain, but in Cumbria, I think there are only 2 of the foresters, scarce forester, and 2 of the burnets, 6-spot burnet and narrow-bordered 5-spot burnet. Quite difficult to identify until you get used to counting the spots and the position of them. And then this one is the butterflies, and we'll leave that for some. Chris Winnick has covered those quite thoroughly. So I've put this page as intentionally blank, which you see on the utility bills and things sometimes. Right, having gone past the butterflies, we're now back into micro moths. The Pyralidae are quite a big family, about 90 species of those in the UK. Quite a lot of them are accidental imports. They get imported with a cargo of grain or some forest products, and then they go onto the British list, even though there may have been only once. But the top left, bee moth, is a very common one, found indoors quite often, found in moth traps and gardens. The sexes are quite different, and the larvae, caterpillars, feed on debris in bees and wasps' nests. The bottom right is a fairly common moth, Acrobasis advenella. It has changed its name twice in about the last 30 years, which is very confusing because we like to say that scientific names never change, only the vernaculars. So this one has been an exception. Grass moths, these are mainly day flying, which you would see in the grasslands around Kendal or across much of Cumbria. They are, whilst day flying, all 4 of those species have turned up in the moth trap here in Kendal. Some of them can be tricky to identify, but there are some quite good websites pointing out the different features of them. Also in the Crambidae family are the so-called China marks. Beautiful China mark. Top right, Parausta. There are 3 or 4 of these in Cumbria. They sometimes known as mint moths. They feed on marjoram and mint, quite often found in gardens. The bottom one, white-spotted sable, or Anania funebris, has been around in Cumbria probably forever, but it's only really been discovered in the last 10 or 20 years. It's a very, very rapid daytime flyer, very small with a wing length of about 10 millimeters, and really I think had been overlooked. Although it's considered to be endangered, there's probably a lot out there waiting to be found. We'll go on to some of the macro moth species groups now. Drepanidae include the hook tips. Bottom left, Chinese character, which is a perfect bird dropping mimic. Fairly common, again, turns up in moth traps. There are the loop strings, buff archers, top right, and then one of the hook tips, bottom right. The family Lasiocampidae have eggers. The one on the left, smaller egger, was thought to be almost extinct in northwest England, but it has been found around the Cartmel Peninsula and Grange over Sands, mainly by Martin Chadwick, David Benham and Wendy Nelson, and they found quite a lot of instances of this. The caterpillars feed communally in webs. Pale egger at the top, this was in Shropshire, but it is, I have seen it in North Cumbria, and then oak egger. More of the same family, December moth, like its name, flies in December, perhaps from November to January. comes to moth traps in quite big numbers, even on quite cold nights. And then the drinker and the fox moth, they are both mainly moorland species, but again, the fox moth was in the garden trap in Kendal. And then the emperor moth, which many of you will know, it's the only British example of this family Saturnidae. Males and females are somewhat different. The males fly rapidly over moorland and heathland. Females do come to light traps, and the one on the right was in the garden trap in Kendal, caterpillar on the left. And then come to the hawk moths, Sphingidae. We've already seen one of these, the elephant hawk. That was in the macro-micro comparison. There are 18 species in the British Isles, and about 10 of these are found in Cumbria. Some of them come as migrants. The one on the top left, narrow-bordered bee hawk moth, we think that it's very much overlooked in Cumbria. There's only 2 or 3 reliable records of it in recent years, but it does feed on, it's a daytime flyer, and the caterpillars feed on devil's bit scabious. So some of the habitats for marsh fritillary, it's quite possible that narrow-bordered bee hawk moth could be there, and they have the same flight time. Eyed hawk moth hides its eyes under its forewings, but when surprised by a bird or other predator, would spread the forewings and frighten the predator away. Then poplar and hawk lime moths are very common in gardens. We come on to a big family now, the Geometridae, with over 300 species in the British Isles. Many of them are called carpets, I'm not sure why, but 5 of the common ones from our garden would be common carpet, flame carpet, common marbled carpet, silver ground carpet, and garden carpet. They're all double brooded apart from silver ground carpet. So you could find most of them almost through any of these summer months. Just some more Geometridae from our garden. Spring usher, top left, just like its name, it flies very early, and that one was seen in February. Large emerald, it's one of a group of emerald moths, all green. Very beautiful, bright green when they emerge, but they very, very soon lose the scales and can look quite nondescript before long. Riband wave, top right, is a pretty common one, but it's not often we see the second brood of these. That was an autumn example. These are just some more Geometridae from around Cumbria. Top left, the magpie moth is becoming quite scarce now. It feeds on hawthorn. Vestal in the middle is a migrant moth and can turn up almost any time from about April to October, something like that. Water carpet, top right, is a woodland species. I'm not sure how that gets its name. And treble bar is a tricky one. There's a very similar one, lesser treble bar, which looks almost identical. Example of what you call confusion species. These are 2 very common geometrids found in garden traps. They're both similar colour, both the same size, both fly at the same time of year. They are primarily woodland species, but they're quite often seen in the garden. I wouldn't expect anyone to memorise or learn any of this, but it's just the kind of things to be aware of. So common wave above has the slightly speckled appearance and brown cross lines. Common white wave left has darker silver grey cross lines and is a sort of purer white. But once these are been flying a few days and they're worn, they're much harder to separate than that. So it's quite easy to get them wrong. And the advice we would always give is that if you're not sure, just please don't record it or take a photograph and send it to someone. a group called the Thorns. They are, sorry, yeah, there's about 6 or 7 species in Cumbria. They do rest in a different way. Early thorn, top right, rests with its wings completely closed up, as many butterflies do. Dusky thorn below rests with them fairly wide open. Canary-shouldered thorn to the left rests with them sometimes almost closed. But they're not too tricky to do. There are another pair, autumn and September thorn, which are really difficult, and we don't see many of those. Right here we're 3 recent additions. It's not often in Cumbria now that we see new macro moth species. See plenty of new micros, but in a single month, July 2017, 3 new ones appeared in Cumbria. Starting with top right, Peter McQueen in Braithwaite recorded cloaked carpet, often recorded in the Isle of Man and other parts of northwest England, but it's never been seen in Cumbria. But since then, there have been some more of these. Bottom left, least carpet. Martin Chadwick found this in Grange over Sands just 3 days later. That's still the only Cumbrian record, 3 years on. Now, top left, marbled pug was discovered in a light trap at Moreland near Appleby by none other than Stuart Colgate, the recording officer, CBDC. They thought something looked a little bit odd about this and took a photo, sent it to the pug experts, and it was confirmed as marbled pug. And it's still the only known site in Cumbria and in northern England. So that, excuse me, was the original photograph of the first one to be found in Cumbria. That brings us to this group, the pugs. Excuse me, a very tricky group. There are about 50 species in the British Isles, of which about, excuse me, of which about 40 in the northwest. In this field guide, they're shown as they would be museum specimens with the wings pinned out so you can see the hind wing. Very, very difficult. One of the easier to identify ones is the left image, netted pug from Martin Chadwick at Grange. There are about 5 of them, which would be quite easy for anyone to identify. So those are photographs of pin specimens, life size, and these in another field guide are paintings magnified in the natural resting position. So you take your pick there. There's 2 ways of presenting them, like that or that. Local pug expert Brian Hancock has produced this handy book of pugs in northwest England. Goes into some detail about the 45 pug species found here. I think it's still available to buy and updated on the internet. Another family, prominence and kittens, generally fairly furry or hairy moths. Again, these were all Cumbrian examples. And then another fairly obscure family, Arabidae, tussocks, snouts, tigers, footmans. Where on earth did they get these names? I don't know. Herald, top left, overwinters as an adult. Sometimes comes out in winter, hibernates in caves sometimes. Beautiful snout at the bottom is a bilberry feeder. Not very common, but I think more records turning up now. Black archers, bottom right. I found that at Roudsea in August 2013. Thought it was the first Cumbrian record, but then found it had been recorded there 2 days earlier. Some more from the same family. Many of you will recognize cinnabar, bottom left, which is a day flying moth. Caterpillars feed on ragwort. Garden tiger, bottom right. This one came to my light trap 10 years ago, waved black, and it's still the only Cumbrian specimen. As far as we know, there hasn't been another one in Cumbria since. It's a moth from southern England. Caterpillars to feed on fungi and rotting trees. So what I was doing in Kendal, I don't know. Then we come to a big family, the Noctuidae, with top left northern archers. This was the first record in Cumbria in that same month, July 2017, when we saw the other new ones. This was in the trap of Rob Pickett up in Brampton. So we had 3 new species in just over a week in Cumbria, which is quite exceptional. Then flame shoulder bottom left, a very common garden moth. Alder moth caterpillar right, which is always found in a coiled up position. Some more Noctuidae here. Pink barred sallow, come from a group called the sallows, all sort of yellowish camouflage on autumn leaves. Figure of 8, you can see where that gets its name from. Bordered straw, which is a migrant seen most years in Cumbria. Yeah, the commonest of all the Noctuids, large yellow underwing. Quite a big moth. The distribution map on the right is based on 10K squares, and it's found in almost every square. That map is based on 176,000 records. There's even one in St Kilda. So it's almost everywhere, and if there's a blank square, it's probably because no one's been, not because it's there. So it's ubiquitous and it's abundant. Turn up in very large numbers, often seen more than 100 in the garden trap. 2 very special Cumbrian Noctuids, which you won't find in the garden. Northern Dart, which is an upland species, has been recorded over the years at Morehouse National Nature Reserve, but hadn't been seen for about 40 years until 2017. It'd probably been there all the time. Rosy Marsh moth at the bottom. Rob Petley-Jones was then the manager of Rardshire Reserve, found that in 2005. And that was the first English record since the mid-1800s. Had it been there all the time? Possibly. And no other English sites known yet. And finally, Nollidae, which are a miscellaneous group of moths, mainly small. The 2 at the bottom are both only about 7 or 8 millimeters long. So that's the end of those. Lots of pollinators. There wasn't much to add here. The website has a lot of information about pollination in Cumbria, but I did find a reference to a recent study where they found that a lot more moths were carrying pollen than had been thought. And in a study of moths from light traps, 45% of the moths tested were found to be carrying pollen, and it was from 47 different plant species. So it was found that they tend to take pollen from quite common plants, whereas some of the other pollinators, the hoverflies and bees and butterflies, are more specific in the plants that they visit. The one on the right, a small elephant hawk moth, was found in our garden carrying pollen on its face, I thought, but it's actually on its eyes. We sent this photograph to an expert on pollination, and he said, this is the pollinia of the greater butterfly orchid. You will have some of that near your trap. Well, the nearest is about 1.5 miles away. So that's probably where it was from. So there's been a great revival of interest in moths. I don't think I have time to list all these reasons, but it includes the internet and email, obviously, so much online help now, digital photography where we can photograph query moths and circulate the photos, explosion of good field guides, moth traps, portable generators, lots more active retired people in the county, ornithologists who want something else to do during the summer, loving the birding year. And then we're getting a lot of help from Butterfly Conservation Head Office and their staff. If you were starting with garden moth trapping, you'd possibly consider one of these 3 types. I've used all these. Top left is the Heath Trap, small portable, works from a car battery or smaller. That one's about 35 years old and still going strong. just needs the occasional bulb. They're still in production at about just over £100. You get some really good catches in those. Top right was a homemade Skinner trap. That's mercury vapor, which does give out a lot of light, and you need to be somewhere where it's not in your neighbour's face, really, if you're running that kind of light. Bottom, the Robinson trap, which is always considered to be the best of all the mercury vapor ones, but they are quite pricey, getting on for £400 now. I think there will be more use of LED and low energy light traps in future. There's more concern now about light pollution. So I think some of these things may be gradually on the way out. I bought recently a compact Skinner trap. This works from the mains, easily transported, unlikely to upset the neighbours. So it's just a small blue light. There's some of the moths which have been caught in that. In the gardening kennel, I've seen around 525 species, but that's taken 15 years using the and then this Robinson trap. So it's only a quite small garden close to the town centre. And I've had other people helping with the identification. I wouldn't pretend I've done them all. Another kennel garden, Plume Moss. There are some very enthusiastic gardeners and volunteers there. And we've had about 6 or 7 moth evenings over the years, recorded about 180 species. Some of them uncommon. The pimping old pug at the bottom had probably been attracted from Cunswick Scar by our powerful lights. Feeds on burnet saxifrage, which isn't really a garden flower. Around the pond at Plume Moss, we've seen quite a few species. Brown China mark, water veneer, both sort of aquatic species. Just a quick look at field guides. If you're buying a field guide to macro moths, you could choose between these two, both by the same authors, Martin Townsend and Paul Waring, illustrated by Richard Lewington. The one on the left, the field guide, is much more comprehensive and has details of things like distribution, flight season, distribution maps, food plants. But the other one is the same artwork, the same pictures, but is a much thinner book with less in the way of supporting information. You would definitely need one of those two to get started. If you're going to look at micro moths, which we would encourage, then this would be the one to go for. This was issued in 2012. And when people started looking at micro moths, they realized that some of the very small macro moths, they had thought they were micro moths and simply dismissed them. A couple at the bottom, they're both macros. But until the micro book came out, people were simply disregarding those, or some people. And a third one that says invaluable is one by someone called Chris Manley. And that's a photographic guide of every British macro species, almost all the micro moths. It's gone to 2 editions and the third one is in preparation. All the photographs are orientated to face to the northeast, which is easy for making comparisons. And again, there are distribution maps, food plants, flight season and all that kind of thing. So that's really worth having. But the 3rd edition will be out in a few months, so maybe that's worth waiting for. And then the atlas, this real work of art, was produced by Butterfly Conservation less than 2 years ago. It covers all of the macro moths. It's based on 25 million records. You can look at the distribution map sometimes and see a dot and say that was me somewhere if you've been on holiday in some obscure place and recorded a moth. So that's really good. It covers about 900 species. It has flight periods, distribution maps, distribution pre-1970, 1970, 1999, 2000 onwards. Very heavy tome, and you definitely wouldn't take that in the field. And then there's the Cumbria Macro Moth Atlas, which shows distribution of 580 macro moths in Cumbria. An example on the right, Argentine Sable. The open squares mean it has been seen there pre-2000, but not since. it's a moth that's caused some concern, losing its size, but there have been some recent upland finds of it, which is encouraging. This was saying how people used to do it before we had all the motor cars and electronic gizmos. Sugaring, some people would paint a mixture on tree trunks, mixture of sugar and treacle and alcohol, which would attract moths. I've tried it, it's never worked for me. There were early attempts at light traps using tiller lamps. In the olden days, there was more interest in the earlier life stages, people beating the herbage for larvae, taking these away and rearing them through. There were no field guides around in the early days, and people had to go to museums and look at specimens there, which was not something that ordinary working people could normally do. And there was far more interest then in day flying moths. And people had the art of net craft, catching fast flying moths in a net, which I'm pretty hopeless at. There is a revival of interest now in day flying moths. There's a few examples here. Green carpet comes equally to light traps, but flies a lot during the day, anywhere from mountain tops to coastlines. So that's another book worth getting. It's now in its second edition at about £15. So there's 130 primarily day flying moths, which is more than twice the number of butterfly species. And then back to basics. A lepidopterist in Cheshire, Ben Smart, has done a wonderful guide on micro moths found in the northwest, looking just at the leaf mines, caterpillars, the chrysalises, and then a small picture of the adult moth. So there's a lot of information, and it takes you through the 12 months of the year. So if you want to do some mothing in December, it tells you what you can go out and what you should find. A recent addition was Steve, I've mentioned Steve Palmer in Lancashire. He is a co-author of a field guide. It's a field guide in the sense of listing every micro moth and its seasons for each stage: egg, caterpillar, chrysalis, and pupa, and adult. There are no pictures in it. The pictures are from another book, sorry, but it's really a useful guide on the distribution of micro moths and seasonal flight times. This came out only last year, a field guide to caterpillars, wonderfully illustrated, again by Richard Lewington. Well worth buying, again, if you've got a birthday coming up, perhaps. It covers all the macro moths and all the butterflies. And then there's the internet. There are several websites which are helpful in identification. One of them, UK Moths, has been around probably 15, 20 years now. And it's still a current site and updated from time to time with distribution maps. That's worth looking. UK Leps takes most of the British species and looks in a lot more detail at the life stages, starting with the eggs, the larvae, pupae, and adults of each species. UK Leps, well worth looking at there. And then there's, nearer to home, the Cumbria Moth group. We're an informal group of moth people who, on a Facebook website, try to share our findings or share our queries. People post queries on there. No need to be embarrassed if it's, if you think it might be something obvious. So there's always plenty of help available there. Just a quick look at Cumbrian moth habitats. We have some wonderful habitats in Cumbria, a sort of Atlantic woodlands on the left, Boulderstone Car Park, Borrowdale, lots of this nice oak woodland in the northwest of the county, limestone grassland, Great Asby Scar, bogs, Foulshaw, Meathop, places like that. Some pictures from Latterbarrow, which some of you may know, near Grange over Sands. That's the site in summer. The moth left, Anania funebris, is the one I mentioned, the fast-flying white-spotted sable, which is quite often seen there. Another Wildlife Trust site is Hale Moss, a a very, very wet site. I've sometimes take the moth light there, but most of the time it's too wet to go in. I did find this very small moth, Glyphicteryx schenicolella, which possibly was the first Cumbrian record, nectaring on grass of Parnassus. We've seen over 130 species there. It's a wildlife trust site, but very rare anyone visits it. You have to fight through the vegetation to get into it. Another mossland site, Nichols Moss. I spent a night there looking for the rosy marsh moth, the one that was rediscovered at Roudsey not too long ago. Didn't find it, needless to say, but I did find over 80 species, including these two at the bottom, 4 dotted footmen and buff footmen. I helped at an upland site near Bleat Tarn when the Wildlife Trust had a juniper project, and I took the moth light with the juniper project officer looking for a species called chestnut-coloured carpet. We didn't find it, but we did find the juniper pug. And later on, I found a chestnut-coloured carpet on one of my butterfly transects. I walk a weekly butterfly transect just outside Kendal, and came across, I sometimes take the moth trap in at night, and I did find chestnut-coloured carpet there. Very few records of it. Beach green carpet is not so often recorded, mainly day flying, I think. We have something coming up in a couple of months called National Moth Night, now in its 23rd year. It's an annual celebration of moths and recording, and it varies over the years from April to October, hoping to pick up different species. Aiming to put on public events and to invite people to come along. We might try and do something this year, probably on Friday the 9th of July, hoping to run a moth light, possibly at Meathop. But depending on the COVID restrictions then and what our Cumbria branch policy is on distancing, we may be able to do this as a public event. So if you're interested, keep an eye on the Cumbria branch butterfly conservation website. Finally, we come to moth recording. So some recording methods. Number one, which quite a lot of people do, I'm afraid, don't even bother writing them down. No use even to yourself. Don't write them in a notebook, but then not bother to send the records anywhere. That's no use to anyone else and ends up in a skip usually. You can enter and submit records using CBDC software. You can put your sightings on the Butterfly Conservation Cumbria branch website, or you can use online software such as iRecord or the National Moth Recording Scheme's Moths Count, or you can use bespoke biological software like MapMate. Which one you should use? I think it would be best if you're going to start recording moths to have a chat with Stuart Colgate. And depending whether you're going to look for casual records or whether you're going to do a repetitive recording, perhaps in the garden, you may get advice from Stuart as to which is the best recording medium, both for yourself and for him to handle the data. The key thing is, whichever you use, please don't enter the records twice. Whichever method you use, eventually the records will find their way to Stuart at CBDC or to Butterfly Conservation. But in the end, all of them will finish up on the Cumbria database and on the National Moth Recording Scheme database. So the key thing is, please send them in, but only once. This was an example of the Cumbria moth recording form, which is a bit off-putting to some people, but great when you get used to it. You can put in abbreviated names of species, and it will tell you whether it's correct, likely to be correct, or whether it's a new species. If it's a moth that's not been recorded in Cumbria, it will be highlighted there. Then there's, sorry, this is rather faint, but the Butterfly Conservation Sightings page. There's a box you can fill in with sightings. You can either put a grid reference or drop a pin onto a map of the county. You can expand the map. So you just put down basically who you are and your email address, when you saw it, how many. But the web facility also has a reports page, and that lists all the reports which have been put in. So you can find out who might have recorded orange tips yesterday and all this kind of thing. And there's now 7 years data on that. And you kind of sort of dig into that right back to the year 2014. So that's well worth looking at. It is primarily for butterflies, but moth records are equally welcome. Probably about a tenth of all records will be of moths. Then there's iRecord, which some of you may be familiar with. But all these things ask the same things. What is it? Where did you find it? When did you find it? And who you are. I mean, those are the 4 fields of information. Many of them do invite a photograph, which can act as verification if you're not sure about them. And the National Moth Recording Scheme, Moths Count, is very, very similar. They're all a different presentation, but they all ask for the same kind of information. The one I use, only because I have them for a long time, is MapMate recording software. Ideally, it's aimed at counties or areas where a lot of moth recorders will be using that and all network together, so they can synchronize the data periodically, and each recorder will then hold the whole county database. This was just an example, an output from MapMate from our garden in October 2018. So I recorded 7 species, which isn't bad for October. And I've illustrated all 7 of these. So at the bottom, we've got yellow line Quaker, red line Quaker. So I've called that a Quaker meeting. And yeah, I mean, those 7 moths, all very, very different looking. And finally, for anybody who's going out mothing in the countryside, sometimes you are viewed with suspicion. I think a lot more people now are aware of moths and moth recording, but sometimes out in the wild, I do get some funny looks from people. This was in County Carlow in Ireland, and I was next to a notice warning me that we shouldn't be doing that kind of thing. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. That was really fascinating. Thank you so much. It's been a really interesting hour. If anybody has any questions.
Too much to cram in.
Was that, sorry, Martin?
I said there's too much to cram in. I should have put half of that in.
No, it was fantastic.
It will be on the website, won't it, eventually?
Yeah.
So if anyone wishes to power through it again, they can do.
Yeah, it's been recorded, so it'll go up on our Get Cumbria Buzzing website. It's really interesting, lots of information to take on board.
Well, there's a lot of moths, yeah.
It's a lot of moths to put into an hour.
Yeah.
So questions are coming in the chat bar. Madja asks, is there any specific species you study, Martin?
Not really. There are things I would like to find. I would love to find rosy marsh moth on one of the other sites other than Roudsey. I would love to find northern dart, but that involves being over 750 meters above sea level and being up somewhere in the very high Pennines. Other people have been and looked. I've been twice setting a lot of traps around Moor House and never found it. So I think I've given up on that. I think those were the 2. Argent and Sable, one which I said seemed to be in decline. It is now turning up in some upland sites where it hadn't been expected. So I'd maybe go looking for that one. So maybe that's 3 species, of which I might hope to find 1. Yeah.
Thank you, Martin. So Belinda asks,
how long keep your light on? Well, turn it on before you go to bed and turn it off in the morning when you get up. Depending on the type of trap, most moths will, once they're in the trap, they will settle down under the light. It would be normal to put egg boxes in traps. Moths seem to like the texture of egg boxes, and they can find little nooks and crannies to shelter in. So when checking, emptying the moth trap in the morning, I pick out the egg boxes, and most of the moths won't fly away unless it's a really, really warm morning. So now we've got long days. Last night I turned my trap on at about 9:30 and turned it off about 5:30 this morning, but I didn't get around to checking it until around 8. And just for the record, this morning there was just one single moth in the big Robinson trap, and that was a garden carpet. And there should be loads now. It's just been very, very cold, and we just hope things will turn up. So really the key is to leave it on. If it's in your own garden, obviously, leave it on all night. But if you're out in the country, you may not wish to leave a trap unattended, in which case you could perhaps go after dark or go at dusk and maybe spend an hour or two with the trap, identifying moths as they arrive. But for garden trapping, definitely all night.
And Wendy asked, does weather have a big influence on moths?
It does. Very cold nights, you normally get relatively few moths. The best nights are really humid, muggy, overcast night. Doesn't matter too much if it's raining or not. Unlike butterflies, moths normally will fly in the rain. But the worst thing would be a cold, clear night with a full moon, and you'd normally expect to see very few moths then. So it is very much weather dependent. And I do record, when I record each day's moths, I do keep a note of just roughly what the weather was, minimum temperature, cloud cover, and amount of rain and wind. Yes, wind is another thing, although if you get strong southerly winds, you can get quite a lot of migrant moths, so that can be favourable. So no two nights are ever quite the same. You can sometimes sense when you put the trap out, this is going to be a good night, or this one isn't. I just do it through force of habit at home. And we do get nights when there are no moths in the trap, and other nights when we've had as many as 60 species in the garden trap. So it's enormously variable. That's part of the fun of it, I think.
Wow, that's interesting. Helen asks, are there clear common features within the different families, or are some family distinctions based on DNA analysis without clear commonalities?
I didn't quite get that, but I think there has been a lot of DNA analysis done in the last 20 years. And the new classification, the blue book, which I showed, showing the families 1 to 74, is based on, I think, largely DNA analysis. The people you call taxonomists here who study species distinction have worked very closely with the European ones. And although it's a UK list of moths, I think there has been a lot of cooperation across Europe with other taxonomists. But it is a fluid situation and things will change, and further research may start to place some moths in different families, or even to create new families, or to merge. They talk about what splitters and what's the other one? Splitters and joiners. Some people who see two moths with a different form and like to think that they're two species and try to separate them and give them each a different name. But then it can be found that if they can still interbreed and produce fertile young, that's fertile eggs, that they would still be considered one species. So it will always go on changing. I don't know if that's much help. But...
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Thank you, Martin. How do you encourage moths into your garden or fields? Is it, I assume, a variety of flowers?
Yes, there are guides and leaflets about which flowers to put in your garden. I think the main thing is to have a good range of flowers. Avoid using pesticides and herbicides as much as possible. A mixture of small and large flowering plants. Things like honeysuckle is supposed to be a good one, and Nicotiana, which is an annual, which is very good for attracting. These are things which give out a scent in the evening, and then the moths will probably stay through the night.
Mm-hmm.
And then jasmine. Yeah, and many of the caterpillars feed on what we would call weeds. I mean, it's like nettles for butterflies. I mean, many people will try to get rid of nettles from the garden, but butterfly people wouldn't want them to do that. There are some moth species feed on nettles as well. So it's really, if you can leave a corner of your garden fairly untidy, that's probably a help as well.
Yeah, that's great. We could all do that in our garden.
Well, it's an excuse to do nothing, yeah.
Yeah, to be lazy. Nick asked, do we know why moths are in decline?
I don't think anyone's quite put the finger on it. I mean, they're blaming agricultural methods, change of land use. More and more land is being taken out, being used for urban purposes. A lot of wasteland, so-called brownfield sites, which are often very good for Lepidoptera, are being put back into industrial or housing use. I think agricultural practices have a lot to do with it. Climate change, well, I think that has, but it's still a lot of research being done on that. It must be contributing to the decline. I think sometimes gardens are very good places, and when a so-called greenfield site is converted to housing, I think that could be beneficial for butterflies and moths. A lot of so-called greenfield sites are really quite sterile or arid as far as insects are concerned. And if they were to build houses and get keen gardeners there, then they can be creating much better habitats.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a combination of agricultural practices, climate change, and changes in land use, I suppose, are the three main ones.
Yeah, that's great. Should we go for one last question?
Yeah, if you like, yeah.
So from Helen, after checking traps, where's the best place to place moths?
Yeah, I think the best place is to put them way out of sight of the original spot. If you have a front and a back to your house, if you're on the trap in the front garden, find somewhere in the back garden to leave them. I put mine through the day in a bucket on the egg boxes, and I leave a lid propped slightly open so that when it comes dusk, they will just fly out. And I take care not to turn my trap on until it's almost quite dark, so that the ones which have been kept in the bucket have had a chance to fly away. So the main thing is, if you release them near the trap site, you're very likely to catch the same ones again, and you're really double counting then. So it depends on the situation of your own house, really. But the further away you can take them, the better. But preferably out of the line of sight of your moth trap.
Okay, that's very useful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Martin. So I think that's all questions that have come in. Lots of thank yous and lots of very interesting talk. So thank you so much, Martin.
Good, yeah. Thank you for inviting me.
Not a problem. All right. We'll say goodbye to everyone.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Martin. Bye.
Yeah. Bye then.